The young man held the tattered textbook like a sacred relic, its pages yellow with age and its corners softened by countless hands. Edmund Carlisle stared at his own name on the cover, the author of a book he barely remembered writing. "This saved my village," the visitor said, his accent thick but his eyes unwavering. Edmund's skepticism faltered when the man opened to Chapter 7, a chapter about a massacre Edmund had documented, then been forced to remove, a chapter that shouldn't exist in any published edition in the world. Just before we dive in, drop your living country in the comments. You're about to hear an incredible story. Subscribe now for more just like this. The lighthouse beam swept across Edmund Carlisle's bedroom wall, a rhythmic intrusion he had long ago learned to ignore. 3 seconds of light, 12 of darkness. He'd counted them often enough during sleepless nights over the 15 years since Martha's passing. At 78, Edmund had grown accustomed to the predictable patterns of his life in this remote coastal town. The fog that rolled in every morning, the precise arrangement of his breakfast items, and the undisturbed silence of a home that hadn't welcomed visitors in nearly a decade. Edmund rose at exactly 6 o'clock, his body trained to wake without an alarm. The November chill had settled into the floorboards overnight, and he slipped his feet into worn leather slippers before wrapping himself in a woolen cardigan that Martha had knitted for him before her illness. He moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, boiling water for tea, toasting a single slice of bread, and retrieving the day's newspaper from his porch. The kitchen window offered a partial view of the harbor, where fishing boats were already setting out into the pre-dawn mist. Edmund had chosen this house specifically for that view when he'd retired from teaching 20 years ago. "History needs distance," he'd explained to Martha at the time. "From here, we can see the world without being swept up in it." She had smiled at that, knowing how his mind worked. Now that distance felt less like wisdom and more like isolation. Edmund's days unfolded with meticulous sameness. Reading, occasional correspondence with former colleagues, and long walks along the cliffs when weather permitted. Local townspeople nodded respectfully when they saw him. The professor, they called him, though he had only been a high school teacher with a penchant for writing textbooks that few people read anymore. This morning, Edmund planned to organize his study, a task he'd been postponing for weeks. Boxes of research materials, draft manuscripts, and correspondence with publishers had begun to encroach on his living space, the gradual spread of the past into the present. He was halfway through his tea when the knock came. 3 sharp raps that sounded almost apologetic in their intrusion. Edmund froze, cup midway to his lips. No one knocked on his door unannounced. His daughter Eliza called before her infrequent visits, and the postal carrier knew to leave packages on the porch. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Then the knock came again, more insistent. With a sigh, Edmund placed his cup on its saucer and shuffled to the door. Through the frosted glass, he could make out the silhouette of a young man, too young to be any of his former colleagues. He opened the door just wide enough to peer out. "Mr. Carlisle. Mr. Edmund Carlisle." The young man's voice carried an accent Edmund couldn't immediately place, Middle Eastern perhaps, but with the polished edges of formal education. "Yes," Edmund replied, not opening the door any further. "How can I help you?" The young man smiled, revealing a small gap between his front teeth. He was perhaps in his mid-20s, with olive skin and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed older than his years. A scar traced a thin line along his jawline, disappearing beneath the collar of his coat. "My name is Farid Massar. I've come a very long way to meet you, sir. May I please come in? It's about your book." Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly. Few people mentioned his books anymore. They had been serviceable history textbooks, accurate, well-researched, but hardly the type to inspire international travel. "Which book?" Edmund asked, curiosity beginning to overcome caution. Farid reached into a weathered messenger bag and produced a book wrapped carefully in cloth. He unwrapped it with the reverence one might show a holy text. The cover was faded, the binding reinforced with tape in several places, but Edmund could make out his own name printed below the title, "Forgotten Conflicts," The Hidden Currents of 20th Century History. This one, Farid said. This book saved my village. Edmund stared at the book, then at the young man's earnest face. Against his better judgment, he opened the door wider. "You'd better come in," he said. "It seems we have something to discuss." The young man stepped inside, removing his shoes without being asked, a gesture that spoke of both good manners and an understanding of cultural differences. Edmund led him to the kitchen, where the remains of his solitary breakfast still sat on the table. "Tea," Edmund offered, more out of ingrained politeness than hospitality. "Yes, thank you," Farid replied, taking the seat Edmund indicated. He placed the book carefully on the table, keeping one hand resting protectively on its cover. As Edmund prepared a second cup of tea, his mind raced through possibilities. Forgotten Conflicts had been published nearly 40 years ago, a moderately successful textbook that had gone through 3 editions before going out of print. It had been thorough but unremarkable, certainly nothing that could save anyone, let alone an entire village. "Sugar? Milk?" Edmund asked. "Just as it is, please," Farid replied. Edmund placed the tea before his unexpected guest and resumed his seat. "Now, Mr. Nasser." "Farid, please." "Farid, then. You've come a long way, you say. From where exactly?" "From Madina al-Salam," Farid said. "It's a small village in the Al-Wadi region. You would not find it on most maps." Edmund nodded slowly. The region had experienced decades of conflict, civil wars, border disputes, ethnic tensions. He had covered some of this in his textbook, though always with the careful distance of an academic observer. "And you believe my book saved your village," Edmund said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "I'd be interested to hear how." Farid's fingers tapped a gentle rhythm on the book's cover. "It was not the entire book, Mr. Carlisle. It was Chapter 7. Edmund frowned. Chapter 7 had covered minor border conflicts in the 1960s, hardly the most significant section of the book. He tried to recall the details but found his memory frustratingly vague on the specific content. "May I?" Edmund asked, gesturing toward the book. Farid hesitated, then slid the book across the table. Edmund opened it carefully, noting the worn pages and the many annotations in the margins, some in English, others in Arabic script. He turned to the table of contents and ran his finger down the chapter listings. Chapter 7 was titled "The Al-Wadi Massacre, Documentation and Denial." Edmund stared at the title, then quickly flipped to the chapter itself. As he scanned the pages, his hands began to tremble slightly. This was not the Chapter 7 he remembered publishing. This detailed a 1967 massacre of villagers that had been systematically covered up by both Western and regional governments, an event he had indeed researched extensively but had been advised to remove from the final manuscript. "This chapter was never published," Edmund said, looking up sharply. "Where did you get this book?" Farid's expression remained calm, but his eyes watched Edmund intently. "It was published, Mr. Carlisle. Not in all editions, perhaps, but in the ones that reached certain libraries abroad, including one that made its way to my grandfather's collection." Edmund closed the book, trying to gather his thoughts. He remembered now the publisher's concerns, the diplomatic pressures, the compromise to remove the chapter from the second printing, but a few hundred copies of the first edition had already been distributed. "This still doesn't explain how a 40-year-old account of a historical event saved your village," Edmund said. Farid took a sip of his tea before answering. 3 years ago, when the new conflicts began, certain groups claimed historical precedent for removing our people from our lands. They said there was no evidence we had ever been there, that we were recent migrants with no legitimate claim. His voice remained steady, but Edmund noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped his cup. "Your book provided documentation that could not be denied. Names, dates, photographs, government communications that proved not only our presence, but the previous attempt to erase us." Edmund's academic mind immediately began poking holes in this explanation. But surely there would have been other sources, other documentation. Most records were destroyed in the embassy fire of 1972, Farid said, citing a date and event with the precision of someone who had studied it carefully. The regional archives were lost during the administrative transition and digital records were corrupted during the system overhaul of 2004. He listed each date with the same detached precision that Edmund had once used in his lectures. Your book became the only credible Western source documenting what happened. Edmund felt a creeping unease. The dates aligned with his research, including details he hadn't included in the final chapter. Either Farid had done impressive independent research, or— "You mentioned your grandfather's collection," Edmund said. Was he a historian? A slight smile crossed Farid's face. In a way, he collected truths others wished to forget. Edmund stood abruptly and walked to the window. The morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing fishing boats returning to harbor. His mind worked through the implications of what Farid was suggesting. "I need to check something," Edmund said. "Excuse me for a moment." He made his way to his study, aware of Farid's eyes following him. The boxes he'd planned to organize now seemed like potential evidence in a mystery he hadn't known existed. Edmund knelt beside a cardboard file box labeled FC Correspondence 1980-1985 and began rifling through folders. Finding what he sought, he returned to the kitchen with a thin folder. Farid still sat exactly as Edmund had left him, hands folded patiently on the table. "I kept copies of all correspondence with my publishers," Edmund explained, opening the folder. "Here's the letter about removing Chapter 7. He pushed a yellowed letter across the table. It was dated March 12, 1982, on the letterhead of Cambridge Educational Press. "Dear Professor Carlisle, after careful consideration, we must request the removal of Chapter 7 from the forthcoming second edition of Forgotten Conflicts. While we appreciate the scholarly integrity of your research, concerns have been raised about potential diplomatic sensitivities. The documentation, while compelling, relies on sources that cannot be independently verified to our satisfaction at this time. We value your cooperation in this matter and believe this adjustment will ensure the broadest possible distribution of your otherwise excellent text. Sincerely, Jonathan Hayes, Senior Editor." Farid read the letter, then looked up at Edmund. "You complied with this request?" Edmund felt a defensive heat rise in his cheeks. "I argued against it initially, but eventually, yes. The alternative was having the entire book canceled." He hadn't thought about this compromise in decades, but now it sat between them like an accusation. "I understand," Farid said, his voice free of judgment. "But before you complied, the first edition with Chapter 7 intact had already been distributed." Edmund nodded slowly. "A few hundred copies, mainly to university libraries. I never imagined they would find their way to places like your village." "Knowledge has a way of traveling where it's needed most," Farid said. A silence fell between them as Edmund tried to reconcile this young man's story with his own memories. There was still something that didn't quite add up. "You've come a very long way," Edmund observed, studying Farid's face. "Why? If the book already served its purpose, why seek out an old man who compromised his own work?" Farid's expression changed slightly, a flicker of something Edmund couldn't quite identify crossing his features. "Because there's more to the story," Farid said, "and because I believe you deserve to know what your work accomplished. What you wrote wasn't just history, Mr. Carlisle. It became the future." Edmund checked his pocket watch, a habit Martha had always teased him about. It was not yet 9 in the morning, but he felt as though he had already lived through a very long day. "I think," Edmund said cautiously, "that this conversation requires more than tea. Do you have somewhere to stay in town, Mr. Nassar?" "Farid," the young man reminded him. "And yes, I've taken a room at the Harbor Inn for the next few days." "Good. I'd like to verify some details before we continue this discussion. Would you be available for dinner this evening, 7 o'clock? If Farid was disappointed by the delay, he didn't show it. "Of course. I understand you need time." As Edmund showed his visitor to the door, Questions multiplied in his mind. Farid carefully rewrapped the book in its cloth before placing it back in his messenger bag. "I'll bring this tonight," he said. "Perhaps you'd like to reacquaint yourself with what you wrote." After Farid left, Edmund stood at his window, watching the young man make his way down the sloping road toward town. There was a slight limp in his gait that Edmund hadn't noticed before, an old injury perhaps. When Farid disappeared around the bend, Edmund returned to his study with renewed purpose. He spent the morning excavating boxes he hadn't opened in years, searching for his original notes on the Al-Wadi massacre. His research methods had always been meticulous. Interviews transcribed, documents photocopied, sources cross-referenced. If he had indeed documented what Farid claimed, the evidence would be here. By noon, Edmund had created organized piles across his study floor, but hadn't found what he was looking for. The gap was conspicuous. His notes from the summer of 1981 were missing entirely. He remembered traveling to conduct interviews that summer, but the details had blurred with dozens of other research trips across his career. Edmund reached for the telephone, hesitated, then dialed a number he still knew by heart. "History Department, Professor Mendez speaking." The voice on the other end was crisp and authoritative. "Sophia, it's Edmund Carlisle." A pause. "Edmund, it's been at least 6 months. How are you?" Sophia Mendez had been a colleague at the high school before moving to the local university. She now chaired the history department there and was one of the few people from Edmund's working life with whom he maintained contact. "I'm well," Edmund said, the social niceties feeling like an unnecessary delay. "I need to ask you about something. Do you remember my book Forgotten Conflicts?" "Of course. We still assign portions of it in our Modern Conflict seminar. Not a riveting title, but solid content." Edmund ignored the gentle jab. "The first edition, does the university library still have a copy?" "I believe so, in the archives." "Why do you ask?" Edmund weighed how much to say. "I had a visitor this morning. A young man from overseas who claims my book, specifically a chapter that was removed from later editions, helped prevent a modern atrocity in his village." "The Al-Wadi chapter," Sophia said immediately. Edmund's breath caught. "You remember it specifically?"
"Of course I do. It was your best work. The only time your writing showed real passion instead of just academic precision." There was something in her tone that Edmund chose to ignore. "I need to see that chapter again. My copy of the first edition is missing, and so are all my notes from that research trip." "That's odd," Sophia said. "You never misplace anything. You once lectured me for 10 minutes about proper archival practices when I borrowed your stapler." Despite himself, Edmund smiled at the memory. "Yes, well, even I have gaps. Could you check if the library copy is available?" "Give me a moment." He heard computer keys clicking. "It's listed in the catalog but appears to be checked out. I can put in a request to recall it." "Thank you. And Sophia, do you remember anything unusual about the publication of that book? Any controversy?" The pause that followed was a beat too long. "Perhaps this isn't a conversation for the phone. Why don't you come by my office this afternoon? Around 3? Edmund agreed, his unease growing. After hanging up, he searched his remaining boxes until he found a copy of the second edition of his textbook. As expected, Chapter 7 now covered minor border disputes of the late 1960s, a bloodless diplomatic account that made no mention of the Al-Wadi massacre. At 2:30, Edmund walked the mile into town, taking the coastal path that wound along the cliffs before descending to the harbor. The university sat on a hill overlooking the town, its red brick buildings a stark contrast to the weathered gray of the fishing village below. Sophia's office was exactly as Edmund remembered from his last visit. Books stacked in precarious towers, maps pinned to every wall, and a desk buried under papers. Sophia herself had changed little in the decades he'd known her, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her energy undiminished. "You look well," she said, clearing a stack of essays from a chair. "The hermit life must agree with you." "I'm not a hermit," Edmund protested. "I'm selectively sociable." "You haven't attended a department dinner in 3 years."
The conversation was repetitive. Sophia laughed. Still charming as ever. Now, tell me about this mysterious visitor. Edmund recounted his meeting with Farid, watching Sophia's face carefully as he spoke. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened at certain details. The mention of the village name, the specific dates Farid had cited. "And you have no memory of how that chapter came to be removed?" she asked when he finished. Edmund tapped the publisher's letter he'd brought with him. "I remember the request to remove it. I remember arguing against it. But the specifics of what the chapter contained, that's unclear to me now." Sophia leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You were always careful about what you published, Edmund. Meticulous about sources, conservative in your conclusions. Except for that chapter. What was different about it? You really don't remember?" She shook her head slightly. "It was personal to you. That summer research trip you came back changed." Edmund felt a flicker of something. Not quite a memory, but the shadow of one. Changed how? More passionate about that particular history. More willing to make definitive statements about responsibility and cover-ups. "It was the only time I ever saw you take a political stance in your work." She hesitated. "And there was the woman you mentioned." Edmund's hand, which had been reaching for his pocket watch, froze midway. "Woman? You never said much about her. Just that she'd been your guide, translator, and research assistant during your time in the region. You mentioned she had family connections to the massacre victims." Sophia watched him closely. "You said she had helped you access testimonies and documents that others couldn't." Edmund sat very still, feeling as though he was standing at the edge of a precipice he couldn't see. "What was her name?" he asked quietly. "Emira," Sophia said. "Emira Nassar." The name struck Edmund like a physical blow. Memories began to surface. A woman with fierce, dark eyes, leaning over documents in a dimly lit room, translating survivor testimonies in a voice that remained steady, even as tears ran down her face. The scent of jasmine, heated arguments about how much truth the world was ready to hear. "Nassar," Edmund repeated. "Like my visitor." "It seems unlikely to be a coincidence," Sophia agreed, "though it's a common enough surname in the region." Edmund pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to order his thoughts. "I need to see that chapter, Sophia. I have something that might help." She opened a drawer and removed a manila folder. "After your book was published, I made photocopies of certain chapters for my students, including the original Chapter 7. I kept a copy in my files." She handed him the folder. Inside were photocopied pages, the text slightly blurred, but readable. The chapter title stared up at him. "The Alwadi Massacre, Documentation and Denial." As Edmund began to read, more memories surfaced. He had indeed documented a systematic massacre of villagers in 1967, providing evidence of government complicity on multiple sides. The chapter named names, cited classified documents, and included testimony from survivors. It was, as Sophia had said, unlike anything else he had ever published, passionate, unflinching, and dangerously specific. "I wrote this," Edmund murmured, half to himself. "How could I forget?" Sophia's voice was gentle. "Sometimes we bury things that are too painful to carry, Edmund. Even memories." Edmund looked up from the pages. "Did I ever tell you what happened to her? To Emira?" Sophia shook her head. "You received a letter shortly after the book was published. Whatever it said, you withdrew into your work afterward. When Martha asked me if I knew what was troubling you, I had no answers to give her." Edmund closed the folder, his hand trembling slightly. "I need to speak with my visitor again. And I should call my publisher, Jonathan Hayes. He might remember details I've forgotten." "Hayes retired years ago," Sophia said, "but I believe he still lives in the city. I might have contact information in my Rolodex." As Sophia searched for the information, Edmund stared out her office window at the harbor below. A fog was rolling in again, gradually obscuring the fishing boats and the lighthouse at the harbor entrance. Somewhere in that fog was a young man named Farid Nassar, who carried a book with Edmund's words, words that had apparently changed lives in ways Edmund had never imagined. And possibly, Edmund thought with growing certainty, a young man who was connected to someone he had once known. Someone named Amira Nassar, whose memory he had buried so deeply that even now he could only glimpse fragments of their time together. "Here it is," Sophia said, handing him a card with Hayes's information. "Edmund, whatever you discover, I hope it brings you peace rather than more regrets." Edmund nodded, pocketing the card. "I've invited Farid for dinner tonight. I have a few hours to continue my investigation before then." "Be careful," Sophia warned. "Some stones, once turned, reveal things that can't be unseen." "I've spent my life documenting what others preferred to forget," Edmund replied. "I can hardly shy away from my own history." On the walk back to his house, Edmund stopped at the harbor market to purchase ingredients for dinner. The mundane task of selecting vegetables and fish helped steady his mind, which was now churning with half-remembered images and conversations from decades ago. He had just finished paying when his pocket vibrated, his concession to modern technology, a basic mobile phone that his daughter Eliza had insisted he carry in case of emergency. The screen showed her name now. "Hello, Eliza," he answered, stepping outside the market. "Dad, I was about to leave a message. How are you?" "I'm well," Edmund said, automatically defaulting to his standard response regardless of circumstances. "And you?" "Busy. I'm in Geneva for a conference, then Brussels next week, but that's actually why I'm calling. I have an unexpected break in my schedule. I thought I might come visit next weekend. It's been almost a year." Edmund calculated quickly. Next weekend would be acceptable. He winced at his own formality. Even with his daughter, emotional distance had become his default. "Try to contain your excitement, Dad," Eliza said dryly. "I'll only stay 2 nights. I know how you value your routine." "No, it's not that," Edmund said quickly. "I'm actually in the middle of something unexpected. A research matter has resurfaced." "Research? I thought you were retired." "Apparently the past hasn't retired from me," Edmund said. "A young man visited me today from the Al-Wadi region. He says one of my books saved his village from destruction." There was a long pause on the line. "Al-Wadi," Eliza repeated. "Isn't that where—" "Where what?" Edmund prompted when she stopped. "Nothing. Just— You mentioned doing research there once, I think." Her tone had changed. Become more careful. "What's this young man's name?" "Farid Nassar." Another silence, this one stretching uncomfortably. "Eliza, I should let you get back to your research," she said quickly. "We can talk more when I visit. I'll arrive Friday afternoon." "Eliza, do you know something about this?" Edmund pressed. "It's not my story to tell, Dad." Her voice had softened. "Just be open to what this young man has to say. Some truths take a lifetime to find their way home." Before Edmund could respond, she had ended the call, leaving him staring at his phone in bewilderment. First Sophia, now Eliza, both suggesting he had forgotten something significant about his time in Al-Wadi. About Amira Nassar. By the time 7 o'clock approached, Edmund had prepared a modest but respectable dinner. Roasted fish with vegetables, bread from the local bakery, and a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. Not that he considered this dinner particularly special, he told himself it was merely research. Farid arrived precisely on time, now carrying a small cloth bag in addition to his messenger bag. "I brought dessert," he explained, offering the bag. "Baklava from the bakery in town. They make it almost like we do at home." Edmund accepted the gift with surprise. "You've had time to discover the local bakery already?" "I make it a point to find the best bakery wherever I go," Farid said with a slight smile. "It tells you much about a community." Over dinner, Edmund steered the conversation toward neutral topics. Farid's journey to the town, his observations of the local architecture, his education. The young man answered each question thoughtfully, revealing a sophisticated understanding of history and politics without volunteering much personal information. "You speak like someone with formal academic training," Edmund observed. I studied international relations at university, Fareed confirmed. My English teacher in secondary school was particularly demanding. He had your book in his personal collection and assigned parts of it to us. Edmund noted how Fareed consistently brought the conversation back to the book. I've been reviewing my records today, he said carefully, including the original Chapter 7. Fareed's eyes brightened. You found a copy. My former colleague had photocopies. Edmund took a sip of wine. It's strange, I wrote extensively about the massacre, cited evidence of government complicity, included survivor testimonies. Yet, before today, I could barely recall the details. Memory is selective, Fareed said. Especially when remembering brings pain. What makes you think remembering would be painful for me? I was merely a researcher documenting events. Fareed placed his fork down beside his plate. With respect, Mr. Carlisle, we both know that's not entirely true. The directness of the statement caught Edmund off guard. What exactly are you suggesting? Instead of answering immediately, Fareed reached into his messenger bag and withdrew the cloth-wrapped book. This time, however, he removed something else from between its pages, a photograph which he placed carefully on the table between them. Edmund stared at the image. It showed a younger version of himself, bearded, suntanned, wearing a light linen shirt, standing beside a woman with striking features. Her dark hair was partially covered with a patterned scarf, and her expression was serious but with a hint of something like defiance in her eyes. They stood in front of a stone building, not quite touching but clearly familiar with each other. Amira, Edmund whispered, the name emerging unbidden. My grandmother, Fareed confirmed quietly. Edmund's hand moved to the photograph but stopped short of touching it, as if he feared it might dissolve under his fingers. She gave you access to the survivor accounts, Edmund said. Memories now flowing more freely. Her uncle had been the village elder. She had preserved documents others thought destroyed. Yes. And she trusted you to tell the truth when others wouldn't listen. Edmund looked up from the photograph to study Fareed's face, seeing now the resemblance, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intensity in the eyes. What happened to her? Edmund asked, though part of him feared the answer. She lived a full life. Fareed said, watching Edmund's expression closely. She married a year after your visit, a local teacher, had 3 children, the eldest being my mother, became the keeper of our village's history, and continued documenting the struggles of our region until her death 5 years ago. Relief flooded through Edmund, followed immediately by a more complicated emotion he couldn't name. She married, he repeated. That's good. I'm glad she found happiness. Fareed tilted his head slightly. You didn't know? There was a letter, Edmund said slowly, memories continuing to surface. After the book was published, I was led to understand that there had been consequences for her, because of what I wrote. There were consequences, Fareed confirmed. She was questioned by authorities. Her family was harassed. But the publication of your book also provided protection, documented evidence that could not be easily dismissed. International attention that made further persecution more difficult. Edmund closed his eyes briefly, decades of guilt he hadn't even recognized, suddenly lifting from his shoulders. I thought I had caused her harm. The publisher received threats. They insisted on removing the chapter. I believed I had put her in danger by being too specific, too detailed in my accusations. The opposite was true, Fareed said. Your specificity saved her, saved many people. The evidence you published was later used in international forums, and decades later, when new conflicts emerged, your documentation prevented history from being rewritten. Edmund reached for his wineglass to steady himself. You said earlier there was more to the story. What didn't you tell me this morning? Fareed hesitated, then reached again into his messenger bag. This time he withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. My grandmother asked me to deliver this to you, should I ever have the opportunity to meet you. He placed the envelope on the table. She wrote it before her death, when she knew her illness was terminal. Edmund stared at the envelope, his name written on it in flowing script he recognized immediately. The same handwriting that had annotated transcripts and translated documents that summer long ago. "I'll give you privacy to read it," Fareed said, rising from the table. "Perhaps I could step outside for a few minutes." Edmund nodded mutely, his eyes fixed on the envelope. He barely registered Fareed slipping out onto the porch. When the door closed, Edmund picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the same elegant handwriting. Edmund unfolded it and began to read. "My dear Edmund, if you are reading this, then Fareed has found you, and I am no longer in this world. There are many things I wish to tell you over the years, but circumstances and perhaps my own pride prevented it. First, I must thank you. Your courage in publishing the truth about Al-Wadi when others would not listen gave dignity to those we lost. Though the chapter was later removed, the truth had already taken root and could not be extinguished. Second, I must apologize for the letter you received after publication. My brother wrote it, without my knowledge, believing he was protecting me by severing our connection. By the time I discovered what he had done, too much time had passed, and I had made new commitments that I could not abandon. Finally, I must confess something I have carried these many years. When we worked together that summer, documenting horror but also finding moments of light between us, something beautiful was created. Not just the truth in your book, but something more personal. Fareed is not actually my grandson, Edmund. He is my son, our son." Edmund dropped the letter as if it had burned him, his breath catching in his throat. He picked it up again with unsteady hands and continued reading. "I discovered my pregnancy after you had returned to England. I could not reach you before my brother sent his deceptive letter. When I finally had the means to contact you, years had passed. You were married. I had married a good man who accepted Fareed as his own. Opening this truth seemed only to promise pain for everyone involved. I told Fareed the full truth when he was 21. He has never judged either of us for the choices we made in difficult times. He has your curiosity, your precision of thought, and unfortunately, your stubbornness. He has my family's eyes and our determination to preserve truth. I do not ask anything of you, Edmund. I have lived a life with few regrets, and loving you, briefly but completely, was never among them. I ask only that you see your son truly see him, and know that some beautiful things can emerge even from history's darkest chapters. With eternal respect and affection. Amira." Edmund read the letter 3 times, each word embedding itself in his mind. Memories continued to surface. The growing closeness between him and Amira during those intense weeks of research. The one night when professional boundaries had dissolved under the weight of shared purpose and unexpected connection. The hasty farewell when his visa could not be extended. The promise to correspond, to continue their work together somehow. And then the letter from her brother, claiming harassment of Amira's family by authorities, blaming Edmund's Western arrogance in publishing sensitive information, demanding he never contact her again. Edmund had respected that demand, buried his feelings, thrown himself into editing the second edition of his book with the controversial chapter removed. He had never spoken of Amira to anyone, not to colleagues, not to Martha when they married 2 years later, not to Eliza who was born 3 years after that. But somehow, Eliza knew, and Sophia suspected. They had seen the hollow place in him that he had never been able to fill. Edmund rose from the table and walked unsteadily to the door. Fareed stood at the porch railing, looking out toward the lighthouse whose beam now cut through the evening darkness. "How long have you known?" Edmund asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Fareed turned. In the dim porch light, the resemblance was unmistakable. The set of his shoulders, the analytical gaze that had always stared back at Edmund from mirrors. "Since I was 21, Fareed answered. "Mother, Amira believed in truth, even when it was difficult. Why now? Why come find me after all this time?" 2 reasons, Farid said. First, to fulfill my promise to her, and second, because I believe a man should know when his work has mattered, when words written in one time and place echo forward to save lives in another. Edmund gripped the porch railing, feeling the weathered wood solid beneath his fingers. I have a daughter, he said. Eliza, she's coming to visit next weekend. He stumbled over the implications. She's your half-sister. I know, Farid said simply. Mother followed your career. She knew you had married, had a daughter. She respected the life you built. Did Eliza know about you? The question seemed impossible, yet he had to ask. No, but I wrote to her last month after finding your address. I felt she deserved to know before I appeared in your life. That explained Eliza's strange reaction on the phone. Edmund felt a surge of something like anger. You should have told me immediately who you were. Would you have believed me? Farid asked. Or would you have dismissed me as an imposter or opportunist? I needed you to verify the truth about the book first, to remember Amira and your time in Al-Wadi. Once you remembered her, you might be ready to hear the rest. The logic was sound, irritatingly so. It was exactly how Edmund would have approached such a delicate revelation methodically, with supporting evidence presented in the proper sequence. You're very much like her, Edmund said finally. The strategic thinking, the patience, and like you, Farid added, the need for documentation, the belief that truth matters, even when inconvenient. Edmund felt tears threatening for the first time in years. I missed everything. Your childhood, your education, all of it. You were present in ways you never knew, Farid said. Mother used to say, ask what your father would think whenever I faced an ethical question. She taught me to value precision and evidence as you did. Your book sat on our shelf, a constant reminder that speaking truth had power. The light from the kitchen fell across the porch, illuminating Farid's face, his son's face. Edmund saw in it echoes of his own younger self, but also determination and compassion that must have come from Amira. I don't know what happens now, Edmund admitted. Now we have dinner, Farid said simply. We talk. Perhaps tomorrow you show me this coastal town you've chosen for your retirement. Next weekend I meet my sister. We begin to know each other, not just as historical connections, but as people. And then we see. Farid smiled slightly. History isn't just about the past, Professor Carlisle. It's also about how we carry it forward. Edmund nodded slowly, understanding the profound truth in those words. For decades he had tried to separate himself from the history he documented, believing objectivity required emotional distance. But history wasn't distant or objective. It was intensely personal, a living force that shaped lives across time and borders. Come inside, Edmund said, holding the door open. The food is getting cold, and it seems we have much to discuss. As they returned to the table, Edmund glanced at the photograph still lying between their plates, himself and Amira, captured in a moment long past but suddenly very present. For the first time in years, he felt the fog of isolation lifting, revealing a connection to the world he had tried to observe from a safe distance. The lighthouse beams swept across his window, 3 seconds of light, 12 of darkness. The same rhythm it had always maintained. But tonight, Edmund found himself counting the seconds of illumination rather than the darkness between them. Do you love the story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this one got you thinking, wait until you see the next story. Click the video on screen and keep watching.